Vince Marak's 25-year-old sister, Christy, was murdered in December 1992 in her Greenfield Estates townhouse.
The case stumped authorities for decades until groundbreaking DNA technology finally gave them a suspect last year. Authorities say they submitted DNA samples from their evidence collection to a genealogy database.
DNA on chewing gum and a water bottle helped authorities in Pennsylvania crack a nearly 30-year-old cold case.
This killer was at liberty from this crime, this brutal crime, for longer than Christy Marak was on this earth alive.
Christy Marak's case went unsolved for 26 years. She was strangled to death after a brutal sexual assault and beating that left her unrecognizable. As of January 2019, her killer is finally behind bars. Life in prison, plus 120 years without the possibility of parole. But nothing can bring back the gifted elementary school teacher whose life was violently cut short. I mostly cover unsolved cases because, to me, those are the ones that need the most attention, but I also know it can be comforting to hear that sometimes these families do get answers and the killers face repercussions. And I'm not saying that it means that it's all dandelions and roses now. I imagine the pain of losing someone in such a way lingers with you for a long time. But resolution can happen, and I know for some, Christy's killer being caught has given hope to the community of Lancaster, Pennsylvania concerning another local tragedy, one that has gone 4 decades without answers. Back in March, I was looking through responses from my Google case suggestion form and came across one submitted by Janet Side 7. Lindy Sue Biechler was a name I'd never heard before, and the deeper I dug, I knew I probably wasn't the only one. Articles covering Lindy's case mainly come from one local newspaper and forum posts of online sleuthers speculating about the case. A YouTube search turns up only 3 results and no sign of a video solely dedicated to her. The only other valid information comes from a blogger, podcaster, and true crime enthusiast named Mike Morford, who's been looking into Lindy's case for 10 years. Morford has also obtained documents on Lindy's case from her half-brother, Mike Little, with whom he had contact. The fact that Lindy is very well known by only a handful of people really puzzled me. The more I read about her, the more I knew I wanted to share her story with you today. Hopefully, closure is on the horizon for her family, as it's now been 42 years unsolved. Today, on Dark Matters, the murder of Lindy Sue Biechler. Lindy Sue Little was born to Eleanor Giese and Wayne Little on January 31st, 1956. At some point while growing up, Lindy's parents separated. Lindy reportedly lived with her mother during high school, and her father went on to have a son named Mike Little in a later partnership. Despite the approximate decade between the half-siblings, Mike Little remembered Lindy as loyal, a free spirit, and having a good work ethic. Lindy's boyfriend, Philip Biechler, was drawn to her extreme compassion and charming demeanor, so much so that they married. By 1975, 19-year-old Lindy was now Lindy Sue Biechler. She and Phil lived in Unit 104A at the Spring Manor Apartments in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Phil worked at a Hertz car rental store while also attending classes at Millersville State College, while Lindy worked at a flower shop. Unfortunately, not long into their marriage, Lindy started to feel uneasy in her first-floor unit. It's not exactly clear when Lindy started to suspect she was being watched, but her brother recalled a particular incident that seemed to rattle his sister in an interview with Morford on his podcast, The Murder in My Family. Mike couldn't remember exactly when this happened, but referred to Phil as her boyfriend, so possibly in the time Lindy and Phil were dating, but had not yet tied the knot. Lindy and Phil were visiting Mike and his other sister at Mike's parents' house when a crash erupted from the second floor. A mirror had fallen over. However, Lindy didn't just brush this off. She insisted Phil check the entire house and seemed unnerved by the incident. Mike wasn't sure if her reaction stemmed from the belief that she was being followed or if she was just particularly spooked that night. What we do know is, in the weeks leading up to December of 1975, Lindy complained to friends and family that, for weeks, she felt she was being watched or followed. One particular evening, she'd actually seen someone peeking into her apartment through the sliding glass doors, which terrified her to the point that she was fearful of being home alone at night, especially with winter approaching and darkness falling earlier and earlier each day. Unfortunately, due to conflicting schedules, Phil was often at work for a while after Lindy got home from the flower shop, placing her in that exact scenario. Which is exactly what happened the evening of December 5th, 1975. After getting off work, Lindy goes to visit Phil at the Hertz location, then goes grocery shopping in nearby Millersville, before heading back to the apartment alone. She arrives approximately 7:15 p.m. and proceeds to carry her groceries inside, possibly taking 2 trips out to the car. Nearby, Lindy's Uncle Merle and Aunt Celeste are on their way to their child's basketball game. They decide to stop by Lindy's apartment and invite her along, possibly to make sure she didn't have to be home alone that evening. They pull up to her building around 8:40 p.m. and Celeste goes to fetch Lindy while Merle stays in the car. She gets to the door of 104A and finds it unlocked, which is the first red flag. Upon stepping inside and calling for her niece, Celeste spots an overturned lamp in the living room. Then she sees Lindy, fully clothed, lying face up on the kitchen floor between the breakfast nook and living room with a long butcher knife protruding from her neck. Panicked and shaken, Celeste and Merle call 911, and when the police arrive at the scene, they immediately contact detectives, knowing that they are dealing with a homicide. Then, Phil is notified of his wife's demise, and when Lindy's father hears the news, he reportedly became so violently distressed, police had to restrain him. Lindy's life was stolen from her, and she was gone, but the investigation into who was responsible is still not over. Police determine none of Lindy's neighbors were home during her final moments, but the DNA gathered from the crime scene told them she had viciously fought for her life. Yet there was no sign of forced entry. This possibly indicates that Lindy knew her attacker or that they slipped into her apartment while she was bringing groceries inside. However, there's no definitive evidence to say exactly how she was cornered. Authorities reportedly thought the attack was sexually motivated, even though there was no indication Lindy had been sexually assaulted. Nothing appeared to be missing or rifled through, ruling out a robbery. It's only when the medical examiner's autopsy results come in that authorities realize Lindy's killer possibly came prepared. It is widely reported that Lindy was stabbed 11 times, but according to the autopsy report posted by Mike Morford to online forums, that number was actually 19. 3 times to the neck, 11 to her chest and upper abdomen, and 5 to her back. The 8-inch butcher knife in Lindy's neck was from her own kitchen, but there was a second knife used in the attack that has never been located, and police presume the killer brought it with them. Her official cause of death was massive bleeding. Police felt the number of stab wounds was overkill, and a retired FBI agent who worked as a consultant on Lindy's case believes the killer dealt a crippling blow early on in the attack, but rage motivated the numerous stab wounds. Police collected evidence, interviewed friends, family, co-workers, and initially focused heavily on Phil as a suspect, despite him being at work when his wife was attacked. When they moved on to other leads, they had no concrete motive or suspect, though there were a couple of people police expressed interest in questioning. An 18-year-old Lancaster man named Mark Capilupo committed violent sexual acts on 4 local women, attacking them with a screwdriver and tying them up with their own clothes, and in one instance, trying to run them over with his car. Both Manor Township and Lancaster police wanted to speak to Capilupo in relation to Lindy's murder, which happened around the same time. I wasn't able to find if police questioned him or not, or ruled him out, before he was actually shot and killed by a guard in July of 1976, when he attempted a prison escape. But there's been no further word of his potential involvement, and to me that usually indicates someone's been ruled out, but we can't know for sure from the sources that I had. Then, 4 months after Lindy's death in March of 1976, there was another murder in Columbia, which is just under 15 miles from Lancaster. 43-year-old Mary Shinzing was stabbed dozens of times, which resulted in her death. And immediately, authorities saw the similarities between Lindy's and Mary's cases, but when the culprit, a 36-year-old man named Kenneth Dale Arndt, was sentenced to life in prison for the murder, there was no link mentioned. Just under a year after Lindy's death, family and friends place a headstone over her grave, one that reads, "Gone, but not forgotten." Loved ones spend their first Christmas without her, but on the 26th decide to visit her grave at the cemetery behind a local Methodist church. But instead of it bringing them comfort, it only reopens their wounds. They find Lindy's headstone slathered in red paint, chipped in several places, yet every other grave sits completely untouched. Police investigated the incident, but no one was ever arrested, and that wasn't the end of the alarming antics. In January 1977, a letter marked "Urgent" arrives at the Manor Township Police Department, addressed to Chief Donald Sheeler, and when he opens it, he finds a 2-page handwritten letter. The handwriting contained various misspellings and capitalizations, and a postscript at the bottom, seemingly written by a second individual. So, let's take a look at the contents of the letter, which, fair warning, is rather disturbing and honestly makes me feel uncomfortable to read it out loud, but here we go. "Hi, Sheeler. Just eats up your heart knowing you haven't caught me yet. Still around. Lindy's marker on her grave just turned me on like she did, and the way she looked all bloody, like the paint on her marker, the scratch and nick marks represent the knife stabs. Count them. You wondered if the guy at the gas station in Mountville were related to Biechler's murder? Forget it, man. No way. I'll tell you what, Chief Pig, you print this letter in the paper along with a picture in Friday night's Lancaster paper and Saturday morning's paper, and I might confess when I get off my trip. You see, the world owes me a living. Maybe I give you a few hints who I am. Got busted once for drugs a few years back, live in west end of Lancaster suburbs. I am 5 feet 10 inches tall, 205 pounds, fat and beautiful, and capable of killing again without knowing it. December 5th, 1975 was under the stupor of amphetamines, like right now. Well-educated man in the community, single, good job, but God, please, Chief, help me. I am losing my mind. Help me before I kill again. The headaches kill me. Every time it aches, the drugs only calm it temporarily. Will God forgive me? Please print this, Chief, in the paper so I know you got it. Then I write you again. God, I need a priest. What have I done? Help me, please. Now, here is the postscript, which is written in a different handwriting style, supposedly from a different individual, and I'll get more into that later. P.S. Chief Sheeler, my friend has confessed to the killing of Lindy Sue Biechler, as God is my witness. Do as he asks. Print this letter on the front page. I am not aware of his intentions right now, but contemplating murder is not his intentions. He is mentally sick. When the letter appears, then he will turn himself in. He described the relationship he and Lindy had before he killed her. He only realizes it now. When you're on drugs, you're not responsible for your actions. Please, he is asleep now. That's why I finished the letter. All I can tell you, my friend frequents Manor Shopping Center in the evenings and the fields around it, mostly weeknights. He will contact you very soon, and when he does, please bring a Catholic priest to the police station. Janice Crum. So the letter writer is at least aware of the vandalism to Lindy's grave marker, and I'm not sure if that incident was ever published in papers at the time. It's possible authorities made the information public and the writer learned of it from news reports. It's also possible the individual was connected or directly involved in defacing her grave. Concerning the number of chips on the headstone corresponding to the number of stab wounds, authorities said the numbers weren't, quote, far off, but they didn't give a specific number. We know she was stabbed 19 times, and it was publicly reported to be 11 times, so I'd be interested to see which number it's actually closer to. That might help in determining if this was someone who heard of Lindy's case and was playing cruel prank, or someone directly involved. But even that doesn't concretely connect vandalism to letter or vandalism to murder, etc. Going back to the letter, the writer mentions a gas station in Mountville. They are referring to a murder that occurred there around that time at a gas station that detectives were looking into for a possible connection to Lindy's case. Authorities later arrested someone else for that crime, so the writer saying that there was no connection proved to be true. However, that doesn't necessarily mean they were involved in Lindy's death. The clues given about the letter writer's appearance and background could all be exaggerations or flat-out fabrications. The letter is signed Janice Crum, and according to Morford, there was a woman by the name of Janice Crum living in Lancaster County, but reports say that police never found a Janice Crum that would have a connection to the murder. The tone of the letter clearly deteriorates and turns from taunting to almost pleading with authorities, saying if they publish the letter in the paper, the writer might confess or even turn himself in. However, at the time, authorities had several suspects in Lindy's case and felt none of them would have sent such a letter, so they didn't publish it in the paper. Morford believes detectives missed an opportunity here to possibly communicate with the killer or someone who had knowledge of or connection to Lindy's case. In fact, they didn't publicly release the entire picture of the letter until December 5th, 2000, on the 25th anniversary of Lindy's death. Even more disheartening is the fact that the evidence lab lost the original letter, and it's unclear if any physical evidence was obtained before it was misplaced. Authorities still aren't sure if the letter writer was someone playing a cruel joke or if they were actually connected to Lindy's death, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in depth, about the vandalism and the letter, in the theory section. In 2000, District Attorney Donald Totaro initiated a task force to look into Lindy's case. 6 years later, still without a culprit, Lindy's murder caught the attention of the Vidocq Society, a volunteer group consisting of forensic scientists, evidence experts, profilers, former law enforcement agents, and the likes. The group chooses to collaborate with the law enforcement agencies of 12 different cold cases per year. The group listens to the case and offers their varying expertise and information on new technologies in an attempt to help law enforcement find new angles and new leads. They've even had some successes, with 60 to 70% of the cases they've heard leading to a solid suspect, and 50% of the cases having enough evidence to actually make an arrest. There were more than 50 experts at Lindy's case hearing in June of 2006. Lancaster County Detective Joe Giese and Pete Savage presented everything that they had, from the murder details, leads they had followed, interviews, evidence, and what they believed was the motive for the murder, something that's never been publicly announced. However, Detective Michael Landis has said that they didn't believe that Lindy's death was a random act of violence. Following the hearing, authorities said that there were certain persons of interest they wanted to focus on, and things looked up, and former forensic psychologist Richard Walter said the perpetrator had made mistakes and that investigators would soon close in. But in the subsequent decade, either nothing has come of it, or there's not been enough evidence to actually make an arrest. In 2007, Lindy's brother Mike Little began corresponding with Vince Marac, Christy Marac's brother. Both, having lost their sisters to violent, unsolved murders, decided to make a plea to the Lancaster community. After speaking with Terry McDermott of Donovan Advertising, they created a billboard showing a picture of Lindy and Christy with the question, "Do you know who murdered us?" unsolved, unresolved between them. The billboard was supposed to overlook a highway for 30 days, but Donovan Advertising kept it up for an additional 10 days at no cost, and it did what the brothers had set out to do. Local news stations ran stories on Christy and Lindy's cases again, but unfortunately, at the time, it didn't bring forth any new leads. Still, investigators didn't feel that all hope was lost. Former County Detective Joseph Giese, who worked on Lindy's case, said before his death in June of last year, 2018, that the initial investigators, quote, "screwed up. There were a lot of things that were done wrong, but this case was solvable back then, it's solvable now." Mike Little says his sister's case has exchanged agency hands several times, but from my research as of 2018, it seems to be the responsibility of Detective Tricia Major and her partner, Detective Matt Wolf. While Major gets calls from locals asking if Lindy's murderer has been caught yet, and the community clearly still cares, there's been relatively few developments, and 42 years is a lot of time for people to speculate. Mike Morford, the blogger, podcaster, and true crime enthusiast we mentioned before, said that there were several older men in Lindy's social circles. Some have suspected a man who had recently dated Lindy's mother, an investigator on Lindy's case, and even Lindy's boss. There was reportedly also a hospital worker who frequented Lindy's flower shop that drew some suspicion. However, right now there's no further information on possible suspects. However, Morford, at least initially, entertained the possibility that the infamous Zodiac killer had come out of the woodwork after a long absence to kill again. The Zodiac killer is an unidentified individual who murdered 5 confirmed people in California between the late 1960s and early 1970s. The killer claims to have taken 37 lives in all, and professed as such in his letters to newspapers during his active years. These letters taunted law enforcement, bragged about the murders, and threatened more violence and victims if they weren't published in the papers. His letters contained numerous quirks, including misspellings, capitalizations, calling the authorities pigs, and signing off with a cross and circle or using aliases like a citizen, a friend, or Red Phantom. The last of these letters was received in July of 1974, after which he seemed to fall off the radar. Morford wondered if Zodiac moved elsewhere but continued his killings. In this post on ZodiacKillersite.com, Morford details the similarities he sees between the letter in Lindy's case and other known Zodiac correspondences. "Just eats up your heart knowing you haven't caught me yet" sounds similar to Zodiac's "Doesn't it rile you up to have your noses rubbed in your boo-boos?" "I'll tell you what, Chief Pig" sounds like Zodiac's use of blue, pigs, meanies. "Print this letter in the paper along with a picture in Friday night's Lancaster paper and Saturday morning's paper," essentially just like Zodiac. "Loosing my mind, help me before I kill again, the headaches kill me every time it aches, the drugs only calm it temporarily." Like Zodiac's letter to Melvin Belly, Morford draws similarities to the complaints of headaches and the same misspellings of the word losing as loosing elsewhere in this same letter. The vandalism and letter mailing marking the anniversary of her murder is similar to the Zodiac, And 5 feet 10 and fat generally fits what we do know of the Zodiac's description. Concerning that last point, accounts varied, but witnesses generally described the suspect thought to be the Zodiac as somewhere around 5 feet 8 to 5 feet 10 inches tall, with a heavyset build, possibly around 195 to 200 pounds or larger. When Morford contacted detectives on Lindy's case concerning these similarities, authorities seemed to take his comparisons seriously and said that they would contact California law enforcement to compare DNA. However, detectives later told Morford they didn't believe the Zodiac killer and Lindy's letter writer were the same individual. Morford still wonders if the letter writer in Lindy's case at least took some inspiration from Zodiac's letters. Personally, I don't know enough about Zodiac to know if the letters were publicly released on a wide scale at the time of Lindy's murder. If they were available to the public, however, I can completely see the similarities enough to acknowledge that someone could have been inspired by the tone and the grammatical style of them. But also, again, my personal opinion, the handwriting looks rather different. But I'm not a handwriting analysis expert, so take that how you wish. However, FBI profiler James Fitzgerald, who is an expert in forensic stylistics, did examine the letter. He believed Lindy's killer was someone with an explosive temper, and that in the wake of the horrific act they had committed, they would have either taken a nosedive in their life or become heavily devoted to religion, their occupation, or even their family. With all that in mind, Fitzgerald analyzed not only the letter, but the act of vandalism at Lindy's grave, so we're going to go over his conclusions on both of these incidents. He mentioned in both instances it's very rare to see any sort of, quote, follow-up or subsequently written letters. Considering this has been seen very, very rarely, it has to be taken with some level of significance. Here are his conclusions. Letters of this nature are often meant to mislead police with misinformation to turn police's attention away from the actual trail. Fitzgerald believes the letter was meant for this purpose. The letter and the PS at the end, despite the difference in handwriting, were written by the same individual. Fitzgerald cites similarities in capitalization and underlining, spelling, and, quote, other aspects that weren't elaborated on further. The letter writer was possibly left-handed and was possibly a woman or someone struggling with their sexual identity. Fitzgerald believes this for two reasons. One, he says women often write as observers, which is the tone of the postscript. And two, back in 1975, he says, quote, very few men described themselves as beautiful. Police know Lindy's killer is male, so Fitzgerald said he doubted that the letter writer and her attacker were the same person. However, he added this to clarify his thoughts on the matter. It's certainly possible that this person had an indirect or secondary role in the murder. The female could have been at the scene of the crime or set the whole thing up. There's all kinds of possibilities. Concerning the vandalism, Fitzgerald says that they hardly ever see homicides that have this happen afterwards. Because of this, he said the following. Perhaps the vandalism is a substitute act of violence against a victim who can no longer be personally reached. For someone to desecrate a tombstone, that would most likely be indicative of someone who knew the victim and feels some sort of aggression or frustration toward this person, caused by some real or imagined situation which may have taken place with the victim and the offender. He said there was a possibility that the vandalism was committed by Lindy's killer and that it would fit the profile he had previously given. But is there a connection between all three incidents, the murder, letter, and the vandalism? Fitzgerald said this. All three may be related. I would suggest two of the three are related, and possibly all three are. I just don't happen to believe that one person happened to commit homicide, another person just happened to desecrate the grave, and another person just happened to write the letter. As investigators, we have to attempt to identify the linkage of those three and the perpetrators of each. But until there is more information, all we can do is hope for a new development. Can we expect Lindy's case to follow the same investigative methods as Christy Mirak's case? What are the chances that DNA can bring Lindy's killer to the forefront? Well, the last time the DNA collected from the crime scene was tested was back in 2008. Still, Detective Mazur, who is currently overseeing Lindy's case, said with the developments in forensic technology and science within the last decade, they do want to take a second look at what they do have, despite not having as strong of a DNA profile as the one used to track Christy Mirak's killer. And, of course, as Chief Lancaster County Detective Kent Switzer points out, each case is going to be different, and what works for one may not be viable or even possible in another. Since hearing of Christy's murder being solved, Phil Biechler has gained a little hope that his former wife's horrific killing might reach a resolution, despite the investigation being botched in the beginning. While Phil remarried in 1990, he keeps his memories of Lindy close and continues to live in nearby Millersville. Lindy's mother, Eleanor Giese, hoped she would live long enough to know who took her daughter from her and why, but unfortunately she passed away in early 2007, 7 years after Lindy's father, Wayne Little, passed in the summer of 2000. But Mike Little, who is an officer in the U.S. Navy, carries his sister's legacy, pressing for answers, saying, "I'm not going to rest until this is over. Lindy fought for her life. She injured her murderer. I want to fight for her." Lindy Sue Biechler was 19, recently married, and a free spirit who was extremely compassionate. She was murdered on December 5th, 1975 by an unidentified assailant, and the community, law enforcement, and her family all want answers and justice for Lindy, whose life was cut short too early. If you have any information on the circumstances surrounding Lindy's death or her murderer, please contact the Manor Township Police at 717-299-5231. You can also contact Lancaster City and County Crime Stoppers at 1-800-322-1913 or text anonymously to TIP 411 or the number 847-411.